Good morning, everyone. I wanted to give you some advice and further explanation in this video about your second close reading paper. So first of all, let's go ahead and read the directions, and then I'll explain what they mean. The directions read, pick one of the following books to explore. You've got a list of the literary texts that we've been reading. Then it says, please write a paper of 2 to 4 pages that examines one of these works, but that addresses a different aspect of the work than we examined in class. Inevitably, we will have ignored a crucial aspect of the work under discussion, or will have arrived at a conclusion that you feel is incorrect, or glosses over a more important issue. In addition, we might have discussed an idea that you felt was correct, but that we didn't pay enough attention to it. So in this essay, you will address this deficiency. In your introduction, you will situate your thesis as a response to our class discussion, showing how it differs entirely or raises a new or hitherto understudied point. And then you will explain your perspective, showing us how your viewpoint, angle, or approach works through a close reading of the text. And finally, you will explain how your reading changes our understanding of the text. Your analysis will attend to the relationship between what a piece of text says, i.e. its message, and how it says what it says, through metaphor, diction, or imagery, etc., just as you did in your literary analysis. The best papers tend to draw on a very few number of passages, like maybe 1 or 2, to make their case through detailed, well-developed analysis. Okay, so the point of this paper is to give you practice with framing your analysis as a response to an ongoing conversation. And we don't tend to think of papers in this way, but papers are in fact a social act, a means of continuing a conversation that has been begun among you and your classmates. So I want to give you a little bit of advice on how to do this. Let me pull up my PowerPoint presentation. First of all, for this paper, and anytime you're going to be framing a paper as part of an ongoing conversation, there's a few different intellectual moves you can make. 1, you can agree with the conversation. In this case, your job is to explain what you agree with and then to provide evidence that adds on to this point. 2, you can disagree with the conversation. In this case, you need to explain why you disagree with it and then propose another conclusion or another reading. And 3, you can nuance the conversation. In this case, you have a few different options. 1, you can bring up a point that was mentioned but that wasn't discussed in enough detail. And then you'll explore this understudied point in the course of your paper. 2, you can bring up an entirely new point or perspective that changes the conclusion that's reached. And then you'll explain how this new perspective works. And 3, you can concede that one of the parts of the conversation is correct, but not another part. And then you'll explore why the correct point is correct and why the incorrect point is incorrect. So I'll give you an example of what an introduction to this type of a close reading would look like. I assigned a similar project in another class. It was a class where we were reading William Wordsworth, and this was an introduction to a paper responding to something we brought up in class. And it reads, William Wordsworth's poem, We Are Seven, depicts a dialogue between himself and a young girl. Their discussion illustrates the young girl's beliefs of how many family members she has and where they all are. Wordsworth questions her beliefs when he learns from her that her brother and sister have passed away. However, the young girl remains persistent that she's one of 7 siblings, regardless of their whereabouts. Although some classmates felt that the child did not understand death, I disagree. Specifically through the use of dialogue, repetition, and diction, the author, William Wordsworth, renders the idea that children understand the concept of death even at a young age. All right, so what I've done here is I've bolded the part of the introduction where the author begins to frame her thesis as a response to the conversation. As you can see, she says, although some classmates felt that the child did not understand death, I disagree. What she's done with this sentence is she has explained to us or has framed this argument as part of an ongoing conversation. And you need to make this explicit for your reader, or they just will not be able to understand the context of your argument. Then, right after she says she disagrees, she inserts her thesis. And her thesis is a response that explains why it is that the author disagrees. She says, specifically through the use of dialogue, repetition, and diction, the author, William Wordsworth, renders the idea that children understand the concept of death even at a young age. And one of the reasons why I like this thesis is that it not only builds directly on that framing statement where she frames her essay as a response to our class, but it's also specific and argumentative. And when you write a thesis, you want that thesis to be specific to the text. If possible, you want to make it specific, kind of what you're going to be arguing or how you're going to be arguing. And you need to make a claim that's argumentative. The nice thing about the way that we're framing this paper, though, is that it's much easier to make your thesis argumentative because it is already inserting itself as part of an argument. Okay, so in addition, once you have your thesis for this paper, you then will have body paragraphs that are going to prove your thesis. And you're going to prove your thesis through literary analysis, which we sometimes call close reading. Now, we've been doing literary analysis all along in our course. In our discussion boards, when you bring up a quote and explain how you think it supports your position, that is a kind of literary analysis. For this paper, we're definitely going to be doing that kind of literary analysis, and we're going to be, in some sense, sort of doubling down on that. That is, that we're really going to be examining the way in which the constituent features of the text enable the text to say the things that it wants to say. So I understand that literary analysis might seem a little bit strange or unfamiliar to many of you guys. And I think that's because in many genres within the sciences, there's no requirement that authors quote from their sources directly. By this, I mean that typically when I read social science or science papers, they will be referring to authors that have brought up an idea, but they won't be including quotations from that author. That said, good literary analyses actually depend upon both your use of quotations and your exploration of quotations. So the quotations are actually the foundation to a literary analysis. Now, there's a few different ways that you can use quotations when you're analyzing. And I'm going to mention them from sort of the least strong type of evidence to the most strong type of evidence. One, you can weave small quotations, like maybe a few words or up to a clause, into an explanation that you're giving in order to lend authority to what you're arguing. So for example, I have been writing a paper on the history of Miss Marjorie Two Shoes, which is a children's book. I wanted to establish what was going on in the story, and I wanted to make sure that my readers understood that the things that I was mentioning came from the book. So I quoted little pieces of text to show them that I'm actually going back to the book, that I'm not making things up out of thin air. So it says, in the history of Miss Marjorie Two Shoes, Mrs. Meanwell dies, quote, a few days, end quote, after her husband's death. So that's one way that you can use literary analysis. It's really not the strongest way because we tend to find it showing up in like explanations to things that are going on. So the second way that you can use quotations is you can include slightly longer quotes, maybe a clause or up to a sentence or two, to illustrate a point that you're making. So this is a little bit stronger of a means of providing literary analysis. And I'll give you an example. This is actually one of the body paragraphs from the paper whose introduction we just read. It reads, in William Wordsworth's We Are Seven, the young girl clearly sees no difference between her living and dead siblings. After all, when asked where her siblings are located, she answers, quote, and 2 of us at Conway dwell, and 2 are gone to sea. 2 of us in the churchyard lie, end quote. So here you can see what the author has done is she's offered an assertion. That assertion is her reading of the text. And then she's included a textual quotation to illustrate what she's talking about. This is definitely better if you're going to include a literary analysis than just weaving little quotations into an explanation. But it's not the strongest way in which you can do a literary analysis. Because after all, what you're doing in a literary analysis and what you do in any analysis is you're going to take a piece of text, you're going to what I sometimes call unpack or deconstruct it, where you then pick out tiny constituent features of that text, explain what they are, and then show how they contribute to the overall meaning of the text. So I'll give you an example of what this last kind, more robust kind of literary analysis looks like. First of all, you can use a longer quotation, which is a sentence up to a paragraph, and then unpack the quote right after you've included it by showing us how its constituent elements contribute to the meaning of the entire passage or even the entire work. So here's the example. In William Wordsworth's We Are Seven, the young girl clearly sees no difference between her living and dead siblings. After all, when asked where her siblings are located, she answers, quote, and 2 of us at Conway dwell and 2 are gone to sea. 2 of us in the churchyard lie, end quote. And here you'll notice that she's also included the line numbers. Now, once she's given this quote, she is now going to include smaller pieces of that quote in an analysis of how they work. So she says the specific repetition of 2, 2, and 2 allows the reader to believe that this young girl sees her siblings an equal distance from her, despite the apparent differences, and by that she means the apparent differences between them being living and dead. This is a unique aspect, carefully chosen to be implemented into the poem to show that the girl is absolutely certain of her beliefs, regardless of the doubt and disbelief of others. So what you'll notice in particular is that she's quoted the words 2, 2, and 2. She's actually picked apart tiny little words from within that bigger quote, called attention to them for the reader in order to explain how they function in that quote. All right, so here's my last bit of advice when you're writing literary analysis. The first is to choose your quotes wisely and deliberately. If you can't think of a reason why you're using a quote, it sounds like you need to give more thought to what that quote is and possibly to choose another quote. So when you're choosing quotes, you want to choose quotes that are really rich in connotative meaning. That is, you want to choose quotes that will lend themselves to this kind of unpacking that we're talking about. That means that you also need to decide how best to utilize your quote in relation to your argument. And whenever possible, what you want to do is embed your quotations in quotation sandwiches. So a quotation sandwich is a way of handling a quote. It's a sort of like unit of analysis that consists of 3 parts. The first is the top slice, which is an introduction to the quote. The second is the meat, which is the quote itself. And you always want to include a parenthetical page citation for that quote. And then the final is the bottom slice, which is an analysis of how the quote's constitutive features work in relation to your argument, and or an analysis of how the quote as a whole relates to your thesis. So let's take that final example that I gave you. In red, I've marked out the top slice of the quotation sandwich, that is the introduction to the quote. The writer writes, in William Wordsworth's We Are Seven, the young girl clearly sees no difference between her living and dead siblings. After all, when asked where her siblings are located, she answers. What this author's done here in introducing her quote is she's actually given us kind of a topic sentence that is laying the claim for the paragraph. Then she's including a little bit of context to help us understand the quote. Next comes the meat of her sandwich, which is the quote itself. And that quote is, and 2 of us at Conway dwell and 2 are gone to sea. 2 of us in the churchyard lie, followed by the line numbers in parenthetical, in parentheses. And then finally, She has after that a couple of sentences of analysis of the quote, and that's the bottom slice to that sandwich. And it reads, the specific repetition of 2, 2, and 2 allows the reader to believe that the young girl sees her siblings in equal distance from her despite the apparent differences. This is a unique aspect carefully chosen to be implemented into the poem to show that the girl is absolutely certain of her beliefs, regardless of the doubt and disbelief of others. And this particular bottom slice has two elements to it that I think work really well together. One is that in her first sentence, she actually is unpacking the quote to show how there's repetition, what that repetition looks like, the two, the two, the two, and how that repetition works, what it tells us about the child's beliefs. Then from there, she steps back and she then talks to us about how that child's beliefs are indicative of the way in which sort of she sees death in relationship to the narrator. So what she's doing there is she's actually showing us how that quote works to support her overall thesis. All right, I know that doing literary analysis can be a little bit complex. It takes a bit of practice, but it is something that will add a lot of complexity to your argument. It'll add really valuable length. And it's something that you just absolutely want to do because this is how literary analysis is how humanities papers explore the evidence that we have. Please let me know if you have any questions about how to write a literary analysis. I'm more than happy to talk with you further. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing your papers. Thank you.